The letter arrived without warning, and Clara Bennett knew before she broke the seal that her quiet life was about to end. She stood in the small hallway of her cottage, the morning light cutting through the window in a thin gray line, and stared at the handwriting on the envelope. She did not recognize it, yet something about the sharp, confident strokes made her chest tighten. Her fingers moved before her mind agreed to let them. She tore the seal open. Inside was a single card, edged in gold, inviting her to the Hartley Winter Ball that very evening. Clara's breath caught. She had spent the last year building walls around herself, brick by brick, until she almost believed she was safe behind them. She had left the city, left the parties, left every place where a whisper could find her. And now, with one card, all of it threatened to come crashing down. She thought of setting the invitation into the fire. She thought of it for a long moment, watching the flames curl and dance in the hearth, imagining the paper curling black and disappearing into ash. It would have been so easy. No one would question her absence. No one expected the woman who had once been humiliated in front of all of society to return to the very house where her heartbreak had first become public gossip. But her brother, Henry, stepped into the room before she could decide, and the choice was taken from her hands. "You cannot refuse this one, Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent. He glanced toward the door as though someone might be listening, though they were entirely alone. "Lord Whitmore's men came to see me yesterday. They say I owe a debt I do not remember taking. If I do not settle it soon, they will not wait for excuses." Clara's hand tightened around the invitation. "What does that have to do with a ball, Henry?" "Because the only man in this county with enough influence to make the debt disappear is the very man hosting it tonight." Henry's eyes were pleading, a look she had not seen on her older brother's face since they were children. "I need you to go, Clara. I need you to speak with him. He remembers you. He will listen to you before he listens to me." The man Henry meant did not need to be named. There was only one man in the county whose name still made Clara's chest ache when she heard it spoken aloud. Duke Julian Hartley. A year ago he had asked for her hand in a garden full of blooming roses, and 3 months later he had ended the engagement in a letter so short it fit on a single page. No explanation, no warning, just words cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins, delivered by a servant while the entire household stood watching her open it. Within a week, every drawing room in the city knew her name, not as the woman who was to marry a duke, but as the woman a duke had thrown away without a reason. She had endured the whispers for months. She had endured the pitying looks, the sharp-tongued comments disguised as sympathy, the quiet laughter behind fans at every gathering she dared to attend. And then, one gray morning, she had simply stopped attending anything at all. She packed her belongings, left the city, and came to live in this small cottage on the edge of Ashcombe, where no one knew her name and no one cared to ask. It had taken her a year to feel like herself again. A year to stop flinching at the sound of carriage wheels on gravel, thinking they might belong to him. A year to build a life that did not depend on anyone's good opinion. Now Henry was asking her to walk straight back into the fire. "I cannot," she said, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "I cannot face that house again, Henry. You do not understand what it was like. I understand that if I cannot pay this debt, I may lose everything we have left," Henry said quietly. "Father's land, this cottage, everything. I would not ask if there were any other way, Clara. You know I would not." Clara looked at her brother, really looked at him, and saw for the first time how thin his face had become, how the shadows beneath his eyes had deepened in recent weeks. He had never told her the extent of his troubles. He had always been the strong one, the one who managed their finances after their parents passed, the one who insisted she need not worry about anything beyond her own happiness. To see him now, afraid and pleading, frightened her more than the invitation in her hand. "Who is Lord Whitmore?" she asked slowly. "And why would his men threaten you over a debt you say you never took?" Henry's jaw tightened. "I do not know the full truth of it myself. I only know his agent, a man named Gerald Finch, came to the house and spoke of papers with my signature on them. Papers I have never seen in my life. He gave me a fortnight to pay, or he said things would grow difficult for our family." A cold unease settled over Clara's shoulders. She had never heard the name Gerald Finch before, yet something about it made the hair rise on the back of her neck, as though her body understood a danger her mind had not yet grasped. "And you believe the Duke can help us with this?" "He is the only man with the standing to challenge Lord Whitmore's claims," Henry said. "Everyone knows the two families have history. If the Duke were to simply ask questions, Finch would not dare press further. But he will not help a stranger who writes him a letter, Clara. He will help you." Clara wanted to laugh, though nothing about the situation was funny. The idea that Julian Hartley, a man who had discarded her without so much as a word of explanation, would now step forward to protect her brother out of some lingering affection seemed impossible. And yet Henry's fear was real. The debt was real. Whatever danger hung over their family was real, even if she did not yet understand its shape. She looked down at the invitation again. The gold edge caught the light and glimmered like a warning. "I will go," she said finally, though every part of her wanted to say the opposite. "But I go for you, Henry, not for him. Do not mistake my presence there tonight for anything more than that." Henry's shoulders sagged with visible relief. "Thank you, Clara. I would not ask this of you if I saw any other path." "I know," she said softly, though her hands trembled as she set the invitation on the table. "I know you would not." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Her friend Margaret, who lived 2 cottages down and had become the closest thing to family Clara had outside of Henry, arrived within the hour, summoned by a hastily written note. Margaret listened to the whole story with growing alarm, her sharp eyes narrowing at the mention of Gerald Finch. "I have heard that name before," Margaret said, pacing the small sitting room. "My uncle does business in the city. He once mentioned a man by that name, someone who works in the shadows of larger, more respectable men. Nothing good ever seemed to follow him." "That is hardly comforting," Clara murmured, staring at her reflection in the small mirror above the mantel as Margaret helped pin her hair into place. "I did not intend it to comfort you. I intend it to remind you to be careful tonight." Margaret met her eyes in the glass, her expression serious in a way that was unlike her usual teasing manner. "Clara, you are walking into a house full of people who watched you suffer once already. And now, you tell me, there is a stranger threatening your brother, and the only man who can help happens to be the very man who broke your heart in front of all of them. Something about this does not sit easily with me." Clara said nothing, because she felt the same unease curling in her stomach, though she could not name its source. It was more than the fear of facing Julian again. It was the sense that the invitation had arrived at precisely the moment Henry's trouble began, as though the two events were threads of the same design rather than a strange coincidence. By the time evening fell, Clara stood before the mirror in a deep blue gown that Margaret had insisted upon, one that made her look far more composed than she felt. Her dark hair was swept back from her face, and there was a steadiness in her reflection that surprised her. A year ago, she had been a girl who fainted at the thought of scandal. Tonight, she looked at a woman who had survived one. "You look like someone who has nothing to be ashamed of," Margaret said, adjusting the final pin in Clara's hair. "Because you do not, Clara. He is the one who should carry shame into that ballroom tonight, not you." Clara took a breath and nodded, though her heart hammered against her ribs as the carriage rolled up outside the cottage, its wheels crunching over the gravel path. She thought of Henry's frightened eyes. She thought of the name Gerald Finch, and the shadow it seemed to cast over everything. And she thought, despite every effort not to, of the last time she had seen Julian Hartley's face, pale and unreadable, as he watched her read the letter that ended everything between them. She climbed into the carriage, and as it pulled away from the only safe place she had built for herself in a year, Clara Bennett understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever waited for her at the Hartley estate tonight, it was not simply an old heartbreak walking back into her life. It was something far more dangerous, and it had already begun. The Hartley estate rose out of the darkness like something from a half-remembered dream, its windows blazing with candlelight, its long drive lined with carriages that glittered under the winter moon. Clara had once known this house as well as her own. Tonight it looked like a stranger's palace, beautiful and cold, waiting to swallow her whole. She stepped down from the carriage on legs that felt borrowed from someone else, someone braver, and walked toward the grand doors where a footman announced arriving guests in a booming voice. She heard her own name called out over the noise of the crowd, and for one terrible instant, every conversation near the entrance seemed to falter. She had expected this. She had prepared herself for the whispers, the sideways glances, the fans lifted just high enough to hide unkind smiles. What she had not prepared for was how quickly the room seemed to steady itself once the first shock passed. A few heads turned. A few voices dropped to murmurs. But the storm she remembered from a year ago did not come. Instead, there was only a ripple, and then the party continued as though she were simply another guest arriving fashionably late. Clara did not know whether to feel relieved or unsettled by this. She moved further into the ballroom, her eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of her brother's troubles, or of the man named Gerald Finch, though she had no notion of his appearance. Mostly, despite every effort to stop herself, her eyes searched for one face above all others. She found him near the far end of the room, standing beside a tall marble column, deep in conversation with an older gentleman she did not recognize. Julian hardly looked exactly as she remembered, and entirely different at the same time. His shoulders seemed heavier somehow, as though he carried a weight the rest of the room could not see. His dark hair was cut shorter than before, but his eyes, when they lifted and found hers across the crowded room, held the same intensity that had once made her believe, foolishly, that nothing in the world could ever come between them. For a moment neither of them moved. The music continued. The dancers spun past in bright circles of silk and laughter, and in the center of it all, Clara and Julian stood frozen, caught in a silence that neither the crowd nor the orchestra seemed able to touch. Then he excused himself from his companion and began walking toward her. Clara's first instinct was to flee. She glanced toward the doors, calculating how many steps it would take to disappear back into the night, back into the carriage, back into the safety of her small cottage where none of this could reach her. But she thought of Henry's face, pale with worry, and she made herself stay rooted to the spot. "Miss Bennet," Julian said when he reached her, his voice quieter than she remembered, though it still carried the same low warmth that used to make her feel as though he were speaking only to her, even in a crowded room. "I did not think you would come." "I nearly did not," she said honestly. There seemed little use in pretending otherwise. "I am only here because my brother asked it of me." "Nothing more." Something flickered across his face at her words, gone too quickly for her to name it. Disappointment, perhaps, though she told herself she was imagining things. Why should he feel disappointed by anything she said? He was the one who had walked away. "Your brother," Julian repeated slowly. "Henry Bennet." "Yes." Clara studied his expression, searching for any sign that the name meant something to him beyond simple recognition. "You know of his troubles, then?" Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have heard rumors. Nothing more than that, I assure you. Is he well?" "He is frightened," Clara said, deciding there was no purpose in dishonesty. She had not come this far to play games with careful words. "A man named Gerald Finch claims Henry owes a debt he insists he never took. Finch works, or so I am told, in service to a Lord Whitmore, and he has given Henry a fortnight to settle accounts he cannot even remember opening." The color seemed to drain slightly from Julian's face. It was subtle, but Clara had once known this man well enough to read every shift in his expression, and she saw it now as clearly as if he had spoken the fear aloud. "Gerald Finch," he said, his voice careful in a way that made her stomach twist with new unease. "You are certain that is the name?" "Quite certain. Henry spoke of little else all day." Clara studied him closely. "You know this man?" It was not a question, and Julian did not pretend otherwise. He glanced around the crowded ballroom, as though suddenly aware of how many ears might be listening, and then leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping so low that Clara had to strain to hear him over the music. "We cannot speak of this here," he said. "Not in this room, surrounded by half the county's gossips. Will you walk with me to the garden terrace? I swear to you upon my honor, Clara, I mean you no harm by the request. I only wish for a private word. Clara hesitated. Every lesson of the past year told her to refuse, to protect the careful distance she had built between herself and this man who had once shattered her so completely. But beneath the caution was something else, something she had tried desperately to bury. A need to understand. A need to know, finally, after a year of silence, why he had done what he did. And beneath that, quieter still, a growing fear for her brother that outweighed even her pride. "Very well," she said, "but only a few minutes, Your Grace. I did not come here tonight to renew acquaintances." Something like a small, sad smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it did not reach his eyes. Understood. He led her through a side door and out onto a stone terrace overlooking the winter gardens, where the cold night air hit Clara's face like a welcome shock after the stifling warmth of the ballroom. The music grew faint behind them, replaced by the quiet rustle of bare branches in the wind and the distant sound of laughter drifting from an open window somewhere above. For a long moment, Julian said nothing. He stood at the stone railing, looking out over the dark garden, his hands braced against the cold stone as though he needed its support. "I owe you an explanation," he said finally, without turning to face her. "I have owed you one for a year, and I have been too much of a coward to offer it." Clara felt her heart clench painfully at his words, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "Then offer it now, Your Grace. I have waited long enough." He turned to face her at last, and in the dim light spilling from the ballroom windows, she saw something in his eyes she had never expected to find there. Not indifference, as she had told herself for months to believe. Not the cold calculation of a man who had simply grown bored of his engagement. What she saw instead looked remarkably like grief. "The night I sent that letter," he began, his voice rough, "I did not do it because my feelings for you had changed. I want you to understand that above everything else I am about to say, my feelings never changed, Clara, not for a single day since." "Then why?" she demanded, her composure cracking at last, a full year of buried hurt rising sharp and immediate in her throat. "Why would you write such words if they were not true? Why humiliate me before the entire household, before the entire city, if you still cared for me at all?" "Because I received a letter of my own, 3 days before," Julian said quietly. "A letter that threatened to destroy everything, and everyone I held dear, unless I ended our engagement immediately and completely. I was given no time to explain myself to you properly. I was told that any attempt to warn you, or to seek help, would only make the consequences worse. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that walking away was the only way to keep you safe." Clara stared at him, the cold night air suddenly forgot, her mind struggling to make sense of his words. Safe from what? From whom? Julian's gaze drifted toward the dark line of the garden hedges, as though he expected shadows there to be listening. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. "From the very man your brother now owes a debt to," he said, "Lord Whitmore. And from the man who delivers his threats, Gerald Finch." The name hung between them in the cold night air, heavier now than it had ever seemed inside the ballroom. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her, the careful walls she had built over the past year cracking at their foundations, revealing not the closure she had hoped to find in coming here tonight, but the opening chapter of a danger far larger than a broken engagement or a brother's mysterious debt. "You are telling me," she said slowly, her voice barely steady, "that the reason you left me was the same man who is now threatening my brother." "Yes," Julian said, and the single word carried the weight of an entire year of silence. "And I fear, Clara, that this is no coincidence at all." Somewhere behind them, the orchestra began a new song, bright and cheerful, utterly unaware of the darkness gathering on the terrace outside. Clara wrapped her arms around herself against the cold, though the chill she felt now had little to do with the winter air. "Then you had better tell me everything," she said. "From the very beginning, because I did not come here tonight to relive old wounds, Your Grace. I came to protect my family, and it seems I have walked directly into the reason it needs protecting at all." Julian held her gaze for a long moment, something like resolve settling over his features, chasing away the last traces of the guilt that had haunted him since she arrived. "Then let us not waste the little time we have out here unguarded," he said. "Walk with me to the East Wing. There is a room where we will not be overheard, and a great deal I must tell you before this night is finished." Clara looked back once toward the glowing windows of the ballroom, toward the safe, ordinary world of music and dancing she was about to leave behind, and then she followed the Duke of Hartley into the shadows of his own house, uncertain of what waited for her there, but certain now that there was no turning back. The east wing of the Hartley estate had always been the quietest part of the house, reserved for family matters rather than guests, and Clara felt a strange unease walking through its dim corridors again after so long away. Julian led her into a small study lined with books and lit by a single lamp, and closed the door firmly behind them before turning to face her. "Sit, please," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "What I must tell you will take some time, and I think you will want to be seated for it." Clara did not sit. She stood near the window instead, her arms crossed, watching him with the wary caution of someone who had been burned once and did not intend to be burned again without a fight. "I would rather stand, Your Grace. Please begin." Julian studied her for a moment, then nodded, accepting that she would not be swayed. He moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames as though gathering strength from their warmth before he spoke. "You remember my father," he began. "He was not always the honorable man history remembers him as. In his younger years, before he inherited the title, he made certain decisions in business that he later came to regret deeply. One of those decisions involved a partnership with a merchant named Aldous Whitmore, the father of the very Lord Whitmore who now threatens your brother." "I know little of your father's business affairs," Clara admitted. "He passed before I ever had the chance to know him well." "Then let me explain what I know," Julian continued. "My father and Aldous Whitmore built a shipping venture together in their youth, one that eventually collapsed under circumstances my father never spoke of openly. What I have since learned, through papers left behind after his death, is that the collapse was not an accident. My father made a choice that ruined Aldous Whitmore financially in order to save his own family's fortune. He never told anyone the full truth of what happened. He carried the guilt of it silently until the day he died." Clara frowned, trying to follow the thread of his story to its purpose. "And this is connected to what happened between us." "Everything is connected to what happened between us," Julian said, turning to face her at last, his expression heavy with old regret. 3 days before I ended our engagement, I received a letter from a man I had never met, claiming to represent the current Lord Whitmore's interests. He informed me that he possessed documents proving my father's role in the ruin of the Whitmore family decades ago. He said that if these documents became public, it would destroy what remained of my family's reputation and standing, and worse still, it would expose the current Lord Whitmore's own father to disgrace for hiding the truth of his losses for so many years, a fact he had apparently built his current fortune upon deceiving others about. "So this man threatened to expose old secrets," Clara said slowly. "Unless you did what exactly?" "Unless I ended my engagement to you immediately," Julian said, his voice quiet with shame, "and unless I agreed to certain financial terms that would benefit Lord Whitmore's current business ventures." The letter made it very clear that any attempt to seek help, from you, from my own family, from the authorities, would result in the documents being published in every newspaper in the city within a fortnight. I was given no time to think, Clara. I was given no time to explain myself to you properly, or to seek any counsel beyond my own frightened judgment. I believed, in my panic, that the only way to protect you from becoming entangled in a scandal of my family's making was to remove myself from your life as swiftly and completely as possible." Clara felt her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of anger and understanding. "You could have told me the truth, Julian. You could have trusted me with it, rather than leaving me to believe I had simply been discarded." "I know that now," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "I have known it for months, turning the decision over in my mind 1,000 times, wishing I had chosen differently. But at the time, I was a frightened young man facing the destruction of everything my family had built, and I made the choice that seemed safest in the moment, even though it cost me the very thing I valued most. I have regretted it every single day since. And the man who sent that letter, Clara said, her mind racing ahead of his story, already sensing where the threads were leading. Was his name Gerald Finch? Julian nodded grimly. It was. I have spent the past year quietly trying to gather evidence against him, hoping to expose whatever scheme he is truly running before he can cause further harm. I believed I had made progress. I believed the matter was contained, that Finch had gotten what he wanted from Lord Whitmore's business dealings and had moved on to easier targets. I did not know he had turned his attention toward your brother, Clara. I swear to you, I did not know. Clara sank slowly into the chair she had refused only minutes before, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. The pieces of the past year rearranged themselves in her mind, forming a picture far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. It was not simply heartbreak that had shaped the last 12 months of her life. It was the machinations of a man neither she nor Julian fully understood. A man clever enough to destroy a duke's engagement with nothing more than a threatening letter, and ruthless enough to now turn his attention toward an ordinary family with no power to defend themselves. "Why my brother?" she asked quietly. "Of all the people in this county, why would this man choose Henry?" "I do not know for certain," Julian admitted, "but I have a suspicion. If Finch discovered that you and I were once engaged, and that our families remain connected through old acquaintance, he may see your brother as a means of drawing me back into his schemes. Perhaps he believes that threatening someone close to you will force my hand once again, just as it did a year ago." The implication settled over Clara like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of fear through every part of her. "You believe he means to use Henry as leverage against you?" "I fear it is possible, yes." Julian's expression darkened. "And if that is true, then your brother is in far greater danger than a simple debt collector's threats would suggest. Men like Finch do not simply walk away when their schemes fail to produce the desired result. They escalate." Clara pressed her hands together in her lap, forcing herself to remain calm despite the fear coiling tighter in her chest with every passing moment. "Then we must find a way to stop him before he escalates any further. What proof do you have of his previous threats? Surely if you could expose what he did to you a year ago, it would remove whatever power he holds now." "I have some evidence," Julian said, moving to a locked drawer in his desk and retrieving a small bundle of papers. "The original letter he sent me, along with several others I received over the following months, each one demanding further concessions before he would agree to remain silent about my father's past. I kept them all, hoping one day I would find the courage or the opportunity to expose him properly." He handed the papers to Clara, and she studied them carefully by the light of the lamp, her eyes scanning the careful, deliberate handwriting that had orchestrated so much pain over the past year. There was something cold in the precision of the words, a calculated cruelty that made her skin prickle with unease even as she read them. "This is enough to bring him before a magistrate," she said finally, looking up at Julian with growing determination. "Surely this proves his intent to extort you." "It might," Julian agreed cautiously, "but Finch is careful. He never signed his true name to any of these letters, and the identity he used to deliver them was later discovered to belong to a man who no longer exists, a fiction created solely for this purpose. Proving these letters came from him specifically, rather than simply proving their existence, will require more than paper alone. It will require a witness, or a confession, or evidence connecting him directly to their creation." Clara set the papers down on the desk, her mind working through the problem with a clarity that surprised her. A year of quiet isolation had given her time to think, to reason, to build a resilience she had not possessed before her heartbreak. She was no longer the frightened, naive young woman who had once believed love alone could shield her from the world's cruelty. She had survived scandal and isolation, and she found now, standing at the center of a far greater danger, That fear did not paralyze her the way it once might have. "Then we must find that evidence," she said firmly. "Together, if you are willing. I will not simply wait at home while my brother's future and yours hangs in the balance of a man's cruelty." Julian looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise, admiration, and something far deeper that neither of them dared to name aloud. "You would help me after everything I have done to you." "I am not doing this for you," Clara said, though the words felt less true than they had an hour ago, standing on the cold terrace outside. "I am doing this for Henry, and for myself, because I refuse to let a man like Gerald Finch dictate the course of my family's future the way he once dictated the course of my heart." A faint, weary smile touched Julian's lips, though sorrow still lingered in his eyes. "Then we begin tonight. I have a contact in the city, a former solicitor who has been quietly investigating Finch's business dealings on my behalf for several months. If we can reach him before the week is finished, we may yet uncover enough to bring this matter before the proper authorities before Henry's fortnight expires." "Then we should not waste another moment," Clara said, rising from her chair with new resolve steeling her spine. "Every hour we spend here in careful conversation is an hour Finch spends tightening his grip around my brother's future." Julian gathered the papers back into their bundle and moved toward the door, but paused before opening it, turning back to face her one final time. "Clara, before we go any further into this, I must say one thing plainly, whatever the consequences of speaking it aloud. I never stopped caring for you, not for a single day of this past year. I understand if you cannot forgive the choice I made, and I do not ask you to set aside your anger for my sake. But I needed you to know the truth, whatever comes next between us." Clara held his gaze for a long moment, feeling the weight of a year's worth of hurt and longing pressing against her chest all at once. She did not answer him, not yet, because she did not fully trust her own voice to remain steady if she tried. Instead, she simply nodded, a small, careful acknowledgement that carried more meaning than words might have offered, and followed him out of the study and into the dim corridors of the house, toward whatever danger and truth still waited to be uncovered. Outside, the winter wind had picked up, rattling the bare branches against the windows like restless fingers tapping for entry, and somewhere beyond the estate's tall iron gates, in a part of the city neither of them could yet see, Gerald Finch was already setting his next move into motion, entirely unaware that the two people he believed he had successfully separated a year ago were now standing together once again, determined to bring his careful schemes crashing down around him. The carriage rattled through empty streets long after midnight, carrying Clara and Julian toward the address of the former solicitor Julian had spoken of, a man named Peter Lang who lived above a bookshop in the quieter part of the city. Clara sat stiffly on her side of the carriage, watching the dark buildings pass by the window, acutely aware of Julian's presence across from her in a way she resented even as she could not deny it. "You are quiet," Julian observed after several minutes of silence. "I am thinking," Clara replied without looking at him. "There is a great deal to consider." In truth, her mind was a tangle of competing thoughts. The revelation about Gerald Finch and his threats had reshaped everything she believed about the past year, but understanding the reason behind Julian's cruelty did not erase the pain it had caused her. She had spent 12 months rebuilding herself from the wreckage of that single letter, and now she found herself sitting across from the very man who had written it, forced by circumstance into an uneasy alliance she had never wanted. "You are angry with me still," Julian said quietly. It was not a question. "I do not know what I feel," Clara admitted, finally turning to look at him. "I understand now why you did what you did. I even believe you, strange as that may sound after everything. But understanding your reasons does not undo the year I spent believing myself unwanted and unworthy of explanation. You could have found another way, Julian. You could have trusted me enough to face the danger together, rather than deciding alone that I needed protecting from the truth." Julian's expression tightened with old regret. "You are right to hold that against me. I have asked myself the same question countless times since, wondering if there was another path I failed to see in my panic. I cannot change what I did, Clara, however much I wish I could. All I can offer now is my determination to make a different choice this time, whatever the cost to myself. Clara studied him in the dim light of the carriage lamp, searching his face for any trace of the calculating cruelty she had once accused him of in her darkest, most bitter moments alone in her cottage. She found none. What she found instead was exhaustion, and guilt, and something that looked remarkably like hope, carefully guarded but present nonetheless. "We will discuss the past another time," she said finally, turning her attention back to the window. "Tonight, we must focus on my brother's safety, and on finding proof enough to end whatever hold this man Finch believes he has over both our families." The carriage rolled to a stop outside a narrow building with a dark bookshop on its ground floor, and Julian helped Clara down before leading her up a set of external stairs to a small apartment above. He knocked a particular pattern against the door, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slower ones, and after a long moment, the door opened to reveal a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, his expression wary until he recognized his visitor. "Your Grace," Peter Lang said, glancing nervously past Julian toward Clara before ushering them both inside. "This is an unexpected hour for a visit." "Forgive the intrusion, Peter," Julian said, stepping into the cluttered apartment lined with stacks of paper and legal documents. "Circumstances have grown urgent. This is Miss Bennet. I trust her completely, and I need you to speak as freely with her as you would with me." Peter's eyes flickered with recognition at the name, though he said nothing of it, simply nodding and gesturing for them to sit at a small table cluttered with papers. "I assume this concerns Finch." "It does," Julian confirmed. "He has turned his attention toward Miss Bennet's brother, Henry, claiming a debt that does not exist. We need whatever progress you have made in connecting him to Lord Whitmore's schemes, and we need it quickly. His threat against Henry comes with a fortnight's deadline, and I fear that deadline may prove far more dangerous than a simple demand for payment." Peter's expression grew grim as he moved to a locked cabinet and retrieved a thick folder of documents. "I have made more progress than I initially reported to you, Your Grace, though I confess I was waiting for stronger evidence before bringing it to your attention. What I have discovered is troubling. Finch is not merely an agent acting on Lord Whitmore's behalf. I believe he has been manipulating Lord Whitmore as thoroughly as he has manipulated everyone else in this affair." Clara leaned forward, her earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of new information. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Lord Whitmore himself may not fully understand the extent of what is being done in his name," Peter explained, spreading several documents across the table. "I have found records suggesting that Finch has forged signatures on multiple contracts, creating debts that never truly existed, and using the collected payments to fund ventures of his own, entirely separate from Lord Whitmore's legitimate business interests. Your brother's debt, Miss Bennet, may be entirely fabricated, a document created solely to extract payment through fear rather than any genuine financial obligation." "Then we can prove it," Clara said, hope rising sharply in her chest for the first time since Henry had shown her the invitation that morning. "If the debt itself is forged, surely that alone would be enough to free my brother from this threat." "It would help enormously," Peter agreed, "but proving forgery requires comparing the signature on your brother's supposed debt to verified examples of his true signature, along with expert testimony confirming the discrepancy. It also requires convincing a magistrate to take the matter seriously, which will be difficult given Finch's careful efforts to remain hidden behind Lord Whitmore's respectable name. Men of standing are rarely eager to accuse other men of standing without overwhelming proof." Julian's expression hardened with determination. "Then we will gather overwhelming proof. Peter, I need you to arrange a meeting with the magistrate as soon as possible, and I need copies of every document you have collected thus far. Miss Bennet, do you believe your brother would be willing to provide a sample of his true signature for comparison?" "He would do anything to protect our family's future," Clara said firmly. "I will speak with him the moment we return." For the next hour, the 3 of them worked together at the cluttered table, reviewing documents, cross-referencing dates and names, building a picture of Gerald Finch's schemes that grew more disturbing with every new piece of evidence. Clara found herself impressed, despite her lingering wariness, by the careful competence Julian brought to the work, his mind moving quickly through complicated financial records, asking sharp questions that pushed Peter's investigation forward in ways she suspected the solicitor had not considered alone. It was well past 2 in the morning when they finally rose to leave, Peter promising to arrange the magistrate meeting within the next 2 days and to continue gathering evidence in the meantime. Clara felt the exhaustion of the long night settling heavily into her bones as she followed Julian back down the narrow stairs toward the waiting carriage. "You should rest," Julian said as he helped her into her seat. "I will send word the moment Peter arranges the meeting. In the meantime, I think it would be wise for you and your brother to remain somewhere I can ensure your safety, at least until we have resolved this matter fully." Clara stiffened at the suggestion. "You wish us to stay at your estate?" "I understand the difficulty of what I am asking," Julian said carefully, seeing the resistance in her face. "But Finch has already shown himself willing to threaten those close to me, and now those close to you as well. If he learns that we are working together to expose him, I fear he may grow desperate, and desperate men are dangerous men. I would feel far more at ease knowing you and Henry were somewhere I could protect, rather than alone in a cottage with little defense against whatever he might attempt." Clara wanted to refuse on principle alone, unwilling to place herself so completely back into the world she had worked so hard to leave behind. But she thought of Henry's frightened face, and of the forged documents she had just seen spread across Peter Lang's cluttered table, and she understood, however reluctantly, that pride was a luxury she could not afford while her brother's safety hung in the balance. "I will discuss it with Henry," she said finally, "but I make no promises beyond that, Your Grace. This arrangement, should we agree to it, exists solely for the sake of safety. Nothing more." "I understand," Julian said, though something in his eyes suggested he hoped, quietly and against his better judgment, that it might one day become something more after all. "Thank you, Clara, for trusting me enough to work through this together, even after everything. I know I have not yet earned that trust fully, but I intend to." The carriage rolled through the dark, empty streets back toward Clara's cottage, and she found herself watching Julian's profile in the dim lamplight, torn between the anger she had nurtured for a year and the reluctant understanding that had begun, against every instinct of self-preservation, to take root in its place. She did not know what waited for them in the coming days, whether the magistrate would believe their evidence, whether Gerald Finch would strike again before they could stop him, or whether whatever remained between herself and the Duke of Hartley could ever be rebuilt from the wreckage of a single cruel letter. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty as the carriage finally rolled to a stop outside her cottage, and Henry's anxious face appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light within. There was no turning back now. Whatever came next, she would face it standing rather than hiding, and that, she realized with quiet surprise, felt like the first true victory she had won in an entire year of simply trying to survive. Henry agreed to the arrangement before Clara had even finished explaining it, his relief so immediate and complete that she understood, with a pang of guilt, just how frightened he had truly been beneath his careful composure. Within 2 days, they had moved into a guest wing of the Hartley estate, their small cottage locked and left behind for what Julian assured them would be a temporary measure, lasting only until the matter of Gerald Finch was resolved. Clara told herself repeatedly that the arrangement meant nothing beyond simple safety, a practical solution to a dangerous problem. And yet, as the days passed, she found it increasingly difficult to maintain the careful distance she had promised herself she would keep. It began with small things. Julian appearing at breakfast each morning with fresh reports from Peter Lang, his exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath his eyes, yet never once complaining of the hours he spent working late into the night on their behalf. His sister, Lucy, a bright and curious girl of 16, took an immediate liking to Clara, following her through the gardens with endless questions and easy laughter that reminded Clara, painfully, of the warmth she had once hoped to find as part of this family before everything fell apart. And Julian himself, careful and patient in a way that slowly wore down the armor Clara had spent a year constructing. He never pressed her for forgiveness. He never demanded that she set aside her anger for his convenience. He simply remained steady, present, and honest in every conversation between them, and Clara found herself, despite her best efforts, beginning to remember why she had once loved him so completely. It was on the fourth evening of their stay that the first true crack appeared in her carefully maintained resolve. She had gone walking alone in the gardens after dinner, needing air and space to sort through the tangle of feelings that had grown increasingly difficult to ignore. The winter garden was quiet at that hour, the paths lit only by scattered lanterns and the pale glow of a rising moon, and Clara found herself near the same terrace where Julian had first begun explaining the truth of what happened between them. She did not hear him approach until he was nearly beside her. "I did not mean to startle you," Julian said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I saw you walking from the study window and thought you might welcome company, though I understand if you would rather be alone." "I do not mind," Clara said, surprising herself with the honesty of the admission. "The garden feels less lonely with someone else in it." They walked together in comfortable silence for several minutes, the cold air sharp and clean around them before Julian spoke again, his voice careful and quiet. "Lucy adores you, you know. She has not stopped speaking of you since you arrived." "She is a wonderful girl," Clara said, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like days. "I am glad to have got to know her, whatever else happens between us." "I am glad as well." Julian paused near the stone railing, looking out over the dark garden much as he had the night he first confessed the truth to her. "Clara, I do not wish to press you toward feelings you are not ready to offer. I only want you to know that these past days, having you and Henry here, watching you grow close with Lucy, seeing you laugh again even amid all this danger, it has reminded me of everything I lost when I sent that letter a year ago. I do not say this to burden you with guilt. I say it only because I think you deserve honesty, always, even when it is difficult to speak." Clara felt her carefully guarded heart tremble at his words, a warmth spreading through her chest that she had spent a year trying to convince herself she would never feel again. "Julian," she said softly, "I am trying. I want you to know that. I am trying to forgive you, and some days I believe I nearly have. But trust is not so easily rebuilt as understanding. I need time still before I can promise you anything beyond what circumstance has forced upon us." "Then I will give you all the time you require," Julian said simply. "I have waited a year already, Clara. I can wait longer still, if it means one day earning back what I so carelessly threw away." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path, and both turned to see one of the household staff approaching with visible urgency, a folded letter clutched in her hand. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion," the young maid said breathlessly. "A letter arrived just now, delivered by a boy who would not give his name. He said it was urgent, and that it concerned Miss Bennet directly." Julian took the letter with a frown, breaking the seal immediately while Clara watched with growing unease. His expression darkened as he read, and when he finally looked up, the warmth that had softened his features only moments before had vanished entirely, replaced by cold alarm. "What is it?" Clara asked, her heart already beginning to race. Julian handed her the letter without a word, and Clara read the brief, chilling message with mounting horror. It was unsigned, but the careful, precise handwriting matched the letters Julian had shown her in his study days before. The message was short, containing no threats stated outright, yet somehow more frightening for its restraint. It simply informed Clara that her brother's debt would now be doubled, given her decision to seek assistance from certain unnamed parties, and that further interference would result in consequences neither she nor her family would wish to discover. "He knows," Clara whispered, her hands trembling as she lowered the letter. "He knows we have been investigating him." "It would seem so," Julian said grimly. "Peter warned me that Finch keeps careful watch over anyone who might threaten his schemes." I had hoped we could move more quickly than his awareness could follow, but it appears we underestimated him. Before either of them could discuss the matter further, a commotion arose from the direction of the main house, and moments later, Henry himself appeared on the garden path, his face pale and his breathing uneven as though he had run the entire distance from the estate. "Clara," he gasped, stopping before them. "There is a man at the gate. He says he must speak with you directly, and he refuses to leave until he does." "Did he give a name?" Julian demanded, already moving protectively closer to Clara's side. "Charles," Henry said, still catching his breath. "Charles Whitmore. He says he is here on a matter of great importance, and that it cannot wait." Clara felt her stomach drop at the name, memories of a distant acquaintance rising unbidden in her mind. Charles Whitmore was a cousin of Lord Whitmore's, a pleasant and earnest young man she had known briefly in her earlier years in society, before her engagement to Julian, before everything had changed so drastically. She had not thought of him in years, and his sudden appearance now, in the midst of everything unfolding around Gerald Finch's schemes, seemed far too coincidental to be anything but deeply significant. "I will see him," Clara said, steadying her voice despite the fear tightening in her chest. "Perhaps he can tell us something useful about his cousin's involvement in all of this." Julian's expression remained tense with worry, but he did not argue, instead falling into step beside her as they made their way back toward the main house, Henry hurrying ahead to inform the staff that the visitor should be shown to the drawing room rather than left waiting at the gate. Charles Whitmore stood when they entered, and Clara was struck immediately by how much he had changed since she had last seen him years before. Where she remembered a carefree young man with an easy smile, the person before her now looked weary and worn, his fine clothes rumpled as though he had traveled a great distance without pausing to rest. "Miss Bennet," he said, bowing slightly, his eyes flickering nervously toward Julian before returning to Clara. "Forgive my unannounced arrival. I would not have intruded if the matter were not urgent beyond delay." "What brings you here, Mr. Whitmore?" Clara asked carefully, gesturing for him to sit as she and Julian took seats across from him. Charles hesitated, glancing once more at Julian before seeming to gather his courage. "I have come because I fear my family's good name is being used for purposes my cousin never sanctioned. I have recently discovered that a man in his employ, Gerald Finch, has been conducting business under our family's authority without proper consent, extracting payments from families throughout the county through false claims and fabricated debts. I only learned the full extent of it recently, when I discovered documents in my cousin's study that did not match any transactions he could recall authorizing." "You know of Finch's schemes, then," Julian said, his voice carefully controlled despite the tension evident in his posture. "I know enough to fear him greatly," Charles admitted. "And I know enough to fear for anyone who crosses him, which is precisely why I have come to warn you, Miss Bennet. I learned this very afternoon that Finch has grown aware of your brother's connection to the Duke, and of your own presence here at this estate. He is not a man who tolerates interference well. I fear he may attempt something far more drastic than mere financial threats, if he believes his schemes are truly at risk of exposure." Clara exchanged a worried glance with Julian, the letter still clutched tightly in her hand, suddenly feeling far heavier than its thin paper should have allowed. "What would you suggest we do, Mr. Whitmore?" "I have brought what evidence I could gather from my cousin's papers," Charles said, producing a small bundle of documents from within his coat. "It may help strengthen whatever case you are building against him, but I must warn you both, if Finch discovers my involvement in bringing this to you, my own safety may be at risk as well. I ask only that you use this evidence wisely, and swiftly, before he has further opportunity to cover his tracks or escalate his threats against any of us." As Julian accepted the documents and began reviewing them with careful attention, Clara studied Charles Whitmore's anxious face, sensing an honesty in his manner that eased some of her initial wariness, even as the growing danger of their situation settled heavier upon her shoulders with every passing moment. Whatever fragile peace she had begun to find within the walls of the Hartley estate Whatever tentative warmth had started rekindling between herself and Julian in the quiet moments of the past few days. It was clear now that Gerald Finch had no intention of allowing that peace to continue undisturbed. The threat had escalated, the danger had grown teeth, and Clara understood with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened her, that the coming days would demand far more courage from all of them than careful evidence and quiet investigation alone could provide. "Thank you for coming to us, Mr. Whitmore," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm gathering within her chest. "You have taken a great risk in doing so, and I will not forget it. Whatever comes next, we will face it together, and we will not allow a man like Gerald Finch to destroy any more lives than he already has." Julian looked up from the documents, meeting her eyes across the small drawing room, and in that shared glance passed an understanding neither of them needed to voice aloud. The time for careful, quiet investigation was drawing to a close. Whatever waited for them next would require them to move quickly, decisively, and together, or risk losing everything they were fighting to protect. 2 days after Charles Whitmore's visit, Peter Lang arrived at the estate before dawn, his usually composed manner replaced by visible alarm as he was shown into the study where Julian and Clara had taken to reviewing evidence together each morning. "The magistrate has agreed to hear our case," Peter announced without preamble, "but not until the end of the week. Finch has friends in the city who have delayed the proceedings twice already, using influence I cannot trace directly, though I suspect it stems from money rather than genuine authority. I fear we may not have that much time remaining." Julian's expression hardened. "What has happened?" Peter hesitated, glancing briefly at Clara before continuing. "I received word late last night that Finch has been asking questions about Henry Bennett's daily movements, where he goes, who he sees, what hours he keeps. It suggests, Your Grace, that Finch may be considering more direct action against him, rather than continuing to wait for a debt he knows will never be paid on his terms." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "You believe he means to harm my brother?" "I believe he means to use your brother to force your hand, and the Duke's," Peter said carefully. "Men like Finch understand leverage better than they understand honor. If he cannot extract payment through fear alone, he may attempt to extract cooperation through more direct means." Julian was already moving toward the door before Peter finished speaking. "Where is Henry now?" "He went into the village this morning," Clara said, rising quickly from her chair, her heart hammering with sudden dread. "He wished to collect a few personal belongings from the cottage. He should have returned by now." The three of them exchanged a look of shared alarm, and within minutes Julian had called for horses, refusing to wait for a carriage to be readied when speed mattered more than comfort. Clara insisted on accompanying him despite his initial protests, and he relented quickly, recognizing in her set jaw and steady eyes that no argument would sway her from following her brother into whatever danger awaited. They rode hard toward the village, the winter wind biting at their faces, and Clara's mind raced through every possible scenario, each one worse than the last. By the time they reached the small cottage at the edge of Ashcombe, her chest ached with fear so sharp it nearly stole her breath entirely. The cottage door stood open, swinging gently in the wind. "Henry," Clara called, dismounting before Julian could even bring his horse to a full stop, rushing toward the open door with her heart in her throat. "Henry, are you here?" Inside, the small sitting room showed clear signs of a struggle. A chair lay overturned. A vase that had once held dried flowers lay shattered across the floor, its pieces scattered like fallen petals. And on the small writing table, weighted down by an inkwell, sat a single folded note. Julian reached the table first, snatching up the note with trembling hands and reading it quickly before passing it wordlessly to Clara. The message was brief, and far more direct than any of Finch's previous communications. The note explained that Henry was, for the moment, unharmed, but that his continued safety depended entirely upon two conditions. First, that all investigation into Finch's dealings cease immediately. Second, that Julian personally deliver a substantial sum, along with certain documents Finch believed remained in Julian's possession, to an address in the city by midnight the following day. The note warned, in the same cold, precise handwriting as before, that any attempt to involve the magistrate or the authorities would result in consequences too severe to reverse. Clara's hands shook as she lowered the letter, a terrible, hollow fear settling into her bones. "He has taken him. He has actually taken my brother." "We will get him back," Julian said fiercely, gripping her shoulders with a steadiness that helped anchor her against the rising panic threatening to overwhelm her. "Clara, look at me. We will get him back, I promise you that. But we must think carefully and quickly about how to proceed. Finch is dangerous, but he is also careful. He would not have taken this risk unless he believed it necessary to protect something he fears losing even more than the payment he demands." Clara forced herself to breathe, drawing on the resilience she had built over the past difficult year, refusing to let fear paralyze her when her brother's life might depend on clear thinking rather than panic. "You believe he fears exposure more than he desires the money." "I believe both matter to him," Julian said, "but exposure would end everything he has built. Money can always be recovered through some new scheme. His freedom and his reputation with whatever remains of Lord Whitmore's trust cannot be so easily replaced once lost." They returned to the estate at a hard gallop, and within the hour had gathered Peter, Charles Whitmore, who had remained at the estate at Julian's invitation since his warning visit days before, and Margaret, who arrived breathless and furious upon receiving word of Henry's disappearance. The small group assembled in the study, the documents Charles had provided spread across the desk, alongside Finch's various letters, all of them working together to devise a plan that might save Henry without simply surrendering to Finch's demands. "We cannot deliver the payment and documents as he asks," Julian said, pacing before the fireplace with barely contained tension. "Doing so would only confirm that his methods succeed, and would leave him free to continue his schemes against other families in the future. But neither can we risk Henry's safety by refusing outright." "What if we do not refuse outright?" Clara said slowly, an idea taking shape in her mind even as she spoke it aloud, "but instead use the meeting itself as an opportunity to catch him in the act. If Julian arrives at the appointed address as instructed, but the magistrate's men are positioned nearby, ready to move the moment Finch reveals himself and confirms his crimes through his own actions, we might secure both Henry's safety and the evidence needed to end this threat permanently." Peter considered this carefully, his sharp mind already working through the practical challenges. "It is risky. Finch is cautious, and he will likely have men watching for any sign of interference. If he suspects a trap before the exchange occurs, he may simply flee, taking Henry with him or worse. Then we must ensure the trap remains invisible until the precise moment it needs to spring," Charles offered, leaning forward with new determination in his expression. "I know something of Finch's usual methods, having observed his dealings with my cousin's household over recent months. He typically operates with only 2 or 3 men at his side, favoring secrecy over numbers. If we can identify the location in advance and position ourselves carefully, we may be able to overpower his small group without alerting him until it is far too late for escape." The group worked through the remaining hours of daylight and well into the evening, refining their plan with careful attention to every possible complication. Julian would proceed to the designated address as instructed, carrying documents that appeared genuine, but had been carefully altered by Peter to be useless without proper legal authority attached. Charles, familiar with the general area from his own family's business dealings in the city, would help identify positions where the magistrate's men could wait unseen until the appointed signal. Clara insisted, over Julian's strong objections, on remaining close enough to the scene to act immediately should anything go wrong, refusing to sit helplessly at the estate while her brother's fate hung in the balance elsewhere. "I cannot simply wait here," she said firmly, when Julian tried once more to convince her to remain behind for her own safety. "Henry is my brother, Julian. I have already lost a year of my life to fear and hiding. I will not spend the most important night of it hiding again while the people I love face danger without me." Julian studied her for a long moment, something like admiration softening the worry etched across his features. "You have changed a great deal this past year, Clara. The woman I remember would never have spoken to me with such fierce resolve." "The woman you remember spent a year learning that fear accomplishes nothing," Clara replied. "I do not intend to let it accomplish nothing tonight either." As darkness fell over the city, the small group made their final preparations, each member of their makeshift alliance moving into position according to the careful plan they had constructed. Julian rode toward the designated address alone, as instructed, his heart heavy with the knowledge that Henry's life depended on every detail unfolding precisely as planned. Behind him, hidden in the shadows of the surrounding streets, Peter's contacts among the magistrate's men waited for the signal that would send them rushing forward. And nearby, close enough to see the exchange but far enough to remain unseen, Clara waited with Margaret and Charles, her heart pounding with a fear she refused to let show on her face. The address proved to be a narrow warehouse near the city's northern docks, its windows dark and its surrounding streets empty at this late hour. Julian approached slowly, the bundle of altered documents held visibly in his hand, and called out into the darkness as instructed by Finch's note. A door creaked open, and a figure emerged into the dim light of a single lantern hung near the warehouse entrance. Even from a distance, Clara felt her stomach twist at the sight of the man who had caused so much suffering to so many, his expression cold and calculating even as he offered a thin, humorless smile toward Julian. "Your Grace," Gerald Finch said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet street. "How gracious of you to arrive precisely on time. I trust you have brought everything I requested." "I have brought what you asked for," Julian replied, his voice steady despite the danger evident in every line of his posture. "Release Henry Bennet first, unharmed, and you shall have both the payment and the documents immediately." Finch's smile widened slightly, though it did not reach his cold eyes. "I think not, Your Grace. I believe I shall keep young Mr. Bennet close a while longer, simply to ensure your continued cooperation extends beyond tonight's exchange. Men of your standing have a tendency to forget their promises once immediate danger has passed." From her hidden position, Clara felt panic rise sharp and immediate in her chest as she watched the exchange unfold exactly as they had feared it might, Finch refusing to honor even the most basic terms of their arrangement. She glanced toward Charles, who held perfectly still, his hand raised slightly, waiting for the precise moment their plan required before signaling the hidden magistrate's men to move. That moment arrived sooner than any of them expected. A second figure emerged from the warehouse door behind Finch, dragging a struggling, bound figure whose face, even in the dim lantern light, Clara recognized immediately as her brother's. Henry's eyes, wide with fear but unmistakably alert, found Julian's across the narrow street, and in that instant something shifted in the careful balance of the confrontation. Henry, despite his bound hands, threw himself hard against the man holding him, catching his captor off balance in the darkness, and in the chaos of the sudden struggle, Charles gave the signal they had been waiting for. Shadows erupted into motion along the quiet street, the magistrate's men rushing forward from their hidden positions, and Clara, unable to remain still a moment longer despite every promise she had made to stay back, found herself running forward into the unfolding chaos, her only thought the desperate need to reach her brother before anything worse could happen. The narrow street erupted into chaos, shouts and scrambling footsteps echoing off the tall warehouse walls as the magistrate's men closed in from every hidden corner. Clara's heart pounded so violently she could hear nothing but its rhythm in her ears as she ran toward her brother, her only thought his safety, every careful plan and rational strategy forgotten in the desperate need to reach him. Henry had managed to break free from his captor's grip in the initial confusion, stumbling backward against the warehouse wall with his hands still bound before him. The man who had held him whirled toward the sound of approaching footsteps, a knife flashing briefly in the lantern light, and Clara's breath caught in raw terror as she watched him lunge toward her brother once more. Julian moved faster than she thought possible, closing the distance between himself and the struggling pair in a matter of heartbeats, driving his shoulder into the armed man with enough force to send them both crashing against the warehouse wall. The knife clattered uselessly to the cobblestones as Julian pinned the man's arm, and within seconds, two of the magistrate's men arrived to secure him properly, dragging him away in restraints while he shouted curses into the chaotic night. Clara reached Henry moments later, her hands trembling as she worked frantically at the ropes binding his wrists, tears of relief and lingering terror blurring her vision. "Henry, are you hurt? Tell me you are not hurt." "I am well," Henry gasped, his voice rough but steady as the ropes finally loosened and fell away. "Frightened beyond anything I have known before, but well, Clara, truly." Across the street, the true confrontation was still unfolding. Gerald Finch, seeing his careful scheme collapsing around him with startling speed, had backed toward the warehouse door, his cold composure finally cracking as he realized the full scope of the trap that had been laid for him. "This changes nothing," Finch snarled, his eyes darting between the advancing magistrate's men and the warehouse door behind him, clearly calculating whether escape remained possible. "You have no true evidence against me. Whatever papers you believe you carry, Your Grace, they will not hold in any court of proper standing." "You forget," Julian said, stepping forward with a calm authority that seemed to fill the entire narrow street, "that you have just been caught in the act of holding a man against his will, threatening violence with a blade before witnesses that include officers of the magistrate himself. Whatever careful schemes you constructed around forged debts and threatening letters, tonight you have provided evidence far more damning than any document could offer." Finch's composure cracked further, his eyes wild with the sudden understanding that his careful web of manipulation had finally, irrevocably, come apart around him. He glanced once more toward the warehouse door, and for a moment Clara feared he might attempt to flee into its dark interior, disappearing into whatever escape route he had surely planned in advance for precisely this circumstance. But before he could move, another figure stepped forward from among the shadows near the street's edge, someone Clara had not expected to see at all in the midst of the chaos. "It is over, Gerald," Charles Whitmore said, moving to stand directly in Finch's path, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by something far harder and more resolute. "I have given the magistrate's men everything I found in my cousin's private papers, every forged document, every falsified account. My cousin may have been foolish enough to let you operate under his name for far too long, but I will not stand by any longer while you use our family's reputation to ruin innocent people." Finch's expression twisted with something between fury and desperation as he realized the full extent of his betrayal, that the very family whose name he had exploited for so long had finally turned against him completely. "You foolish boy," he spat. "You have no notion of what you have destroyed tonight, nor what you have set free by exposing me so publicly." "I know exactly what I have destroyed," Charles replied evenly. "A scheme built on fear and forgery, one that has already cost an innocent family their peace of mind for an entire year, and very nearly cost this man his brother tonight. I regret only that it took me so long to understand the full truth of what you were doing." The magistrate's men closed in around Finch as he spoke, and within moments he stood in restraints of his own, his careful mask of cold authority finally, completely shattered, replaced by the hollow anger of a man who understood his schemes had reached their end. Clara watched from where she knelt beside Henry, her arms still wrapped protectively around her brother's shoulders, feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering disbelief settle over the scene before her. It was truly over. The threats, the fear, the year of careful hiding and silent suffering, all of it had led to this single chaotic night on a dark street near the city docks, and now, finally, it seemed the danger had passed. Julian crossed the street to where Clara and Henry sat, kneeling beside them with visible relief, softening the tension that had gripped his features throughout the entire confrontation. "Are you both truly unharmed?" "Truly," Henry confirmed, managing a weak but genuine smile despite his obvious exhaustion. "Thanks to all of you. I do not know how I will ever repay this debt, Your Grace, though I suspect it is considerably larger than the false one Finch attempted to force upon me." "You owe me nothing," Julian said firmly. "If anything, I am the one who owes your family a debt that stretches back an entire year, for the pain my silence caused your sister, and indirectly, the vulnerability that allowed Finch to target you at all. Whatever assistance I have offered tonight is merely a small measure of amends, nothing more." Clara looked up at Julian then, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time since her return to his life a week before, not as the Duke who had broken her heart, nor as the frightened young man who had made a terrible choice under threat, but simply as the person he had shown himself to be throughout this entire ordeal. Steady, honest, willing to risk everything, including his own safety, to protect people he cared for, even when his past mistakes might have given him every reason to walk away and let others bear the burden alone. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words carrying far more weight than their simple syllables might suggest, "for everything you have done this past week. For trusting me with the truth, even when it was difficult. For helping save my brother tonight at real risk to yourself. I do not know how to properly express what that means to me." "You need not express anything," Julian said softly, though his eyes held a depth of feeling he made no effort to hide any longer. "Simply knowing that you and Henry are safe is more than sufficient reward for whatever small part I played tonight." As the magistrate's men led Gerald Finch away into the darkness, his angry protests fading into the night, and as Peter Lang moved efficiently among the remaining chaos, gathering statements and evidence to ensure the case against Finch would hold firm in whatever legal proceedings followed, Clara remained kneeling beside her brother in the quiet aftermath of danger finally past, feeling something shift deep within her chest that she had not expected to feel again for a very long time. Hope, genuine, steady hope, unshadowed by fear or bitterness, blooming slowly in a heart she had believed permanently guarded against such vulnerability. Margaret arrived moments later, having waited nearby with the horses throughout the confrontation, her face etched with worry that melted into relief the instant she saw Clara and Henry both safe and whole. She embraced Clara fiercely, whispering fervent relief into her ear, before turning her sharp attention toward Julian with an assessing look that softened, gradually, into something like reluctant approval. "You have done well tonight, Your Grace," Margaret said finally, "whatever I may have thought of you previously." "I intend to continue doing well," Julian replied, glancing toward Clara with quiet meaning in his eyes, "for as long as I am given the opportunity to try." The group made their way back toward the estate as the first pale light of dawn began creeping over the eastern horizon, the long, dangerous night finally drawing to its close. Clara rode beside Henry, her hand resting protectively on his arm throughout the journey, while Julian rode close behind, his presence steady and reassuring in a way she no longer felt any need to resist. As the estate's familiar gates came into view, Clara found herself thinking not of the year of pain and isolation that had preceded this night, nor even of the terror she had felt watching her brother in danger only hours before, but of the strange, unexpected path that had led her back to this place, back to this man, and toward a future she had never dared to imagine might still be possible after everything that had come before. Whatever remained to be resolved, whatever careful conversations still waited to be had between herself and Julian in the days ahead, Clara understood, with a clarity that steadied her more than any promise ever could, that the darkest chapter of the past year had finally, truly reached its end. And somewhere in the quiet space beyond that ending, something new had begun to take root, fragile but genuine, waiting patiently for the chance to grow into whatever it was destined to become. 3 weeks passed before the magistrate's formal proceedings against Gerald Finch concluded, weeks filled with careful testimony, mounting evidence, and the slow, satisfying unraveling of every scheme Finch had constructed over the past year. Peter Lang's patient investigation, combined with the documents Charles Whitmore had bravely provided, and the direct evidence gathered on the night of Henry's rescue, proved more than sufficient to secure a conviction that would keep Finch confined for a very long time indeed. Lord Whitmore himself, mortified to discover the extent to which his name had been exploited without his knowledge, offered a full public statement acknowledging the fraud committed under his authority and pledging restitution to every family Finch had wronged, including a formal apology delivered directly to Henry for the fear and financial threat he had endured. Charles, whose courage in exposing his own cousin's negligence had proven instrumental in ending Finch's schemes, found himself unexpectedly praised throughout the county for his integrity, a reputation Clara suspected would serve him far better in the long run than his family's tarnished name might have otherwise allowed. Through it all, Clara remained at the Hartley estate, though the reasons for her continued presence there had grown increasingly difficult to attribute solely to safety concerns, even to herself. Henry had returned to their cottage within days of Finch's arrest, insisting the immediate danger had passed and that he wished to resume the ordinary rhythm of their lives. Clara, however, found herself lingering, drawn by ties that had little to do with fear and everything to do with the quiet, steady presence of the man whose house she had once been so reluctant to enter again. She and Julian spent their evenings in careful conversation, rebuilding piece by piece the trust that had been so completely shattered a year before. He told her, in halting words that revealed the depth of guilt he had carried throughout that difficult year, of the sleepless nights spent regretting his choice, of the quiet investigations he had pursued into Finch's schemes long before Clara's return, hoping desperately for some way to make amends without further endangering her. She told him, in turn, of the isolation she had chosen in the wake of her heartbreak, of the slow, painful process of rebuilding her sense of self-worth after society's cruel judgment had nearly convinced her she deserved the abandonment she believed she had suffered. Neither conversation erased the pain of the past entirely, but together they began to transform it into something else, something neither of them had expected to find again: understanding. Forgiveness, offered slowly and honestly rather than demanded or assumed. And beneath it all, the same deep affection that had first drawn them together, tempered now by hard-won wisdom neither of them had possessed a year before. It was Lucy, in her characteristically direct manner, who finally voiced what both Clara and Julian had left carefully unspoken for weeks. "You are going to marry my brother eventually," she announced one afternoon, finding Clara alone in the garden where she had taken to walking each day since Finch's arrest. "Everyone can see it, even if neither of you will admit it aloud. You look at him the way people look at someone they have already chosen, whether they realize it yet or not." Clara laughed, startled by the girl's blunt observation, though she could not entirely deny the truth within it. "You are quite forward for someone your age, Lucy." "I am simply honest," Lucy replied with a grin. "And I would very much like for you to become my sister properly, rather than simply a guest who has stayed rather a long time without explanation." That evening, walking together through the same winter garden where so much had already unfolded between them, Julian finally gave voice to the question that had lingered unspoken beneath every careful conversation of the past weeks. "Clara," he said, stopping near the same stone terrace where their reconciliation had first begun, "I know I have no right to ask this so soon, after everything that has passed between us. I know that trust, once broken, cannot simply be restored through weeks of careful conversation alone, however genuine my efforts have been. But I find that I cannot continue pretending indifference to feelings that have never once wavered, not through a year of silence, and not through these past weeks of slowly finding our way back to each other." Clara's heart quickened, though she said nothing, allowing him the space to continue, sensing the importance of whatever words he was working toward. "I love you," Julian said simply, the words carrying the full weight of everything he had endured and everything he hoped for in one breath. "I have loved you since long before that terrible letter, and I have continued loving you through every day since, even when I believed I had lost the right to hope for your forgiveness. I am not asking you to answer immediately, Clara. I know you may need more time still, and I will give you whatever time you require." but I needed you to know, clearly and without doubt, exactly where my heart stands." Clara studied his face in the fading evening light, searching, as she had so many times over the past weeks, for any trace of the doubt or hesitation that had once made her question everything she believed about this man. She found none. What she found instead was simply Julian, honest and steady and finally, completely open with her in a way he had never quite managed to be even before the heartbreak that had separated them for so long. "I do not need more time," she said softly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "I have spent an entire year convincing myself I no longer needed you, Julian, building walls I believed would protect me from ever feeling this vulnerable again. But these past weeks have shown me something I was not prepared to discover. The walls I built were never truly about protecting myself from you. They were about protecting myself from the possibility that I might love you still, despite everything, and that possibility frightened me more than any danger Gerald Finch ever posed." Julian's breath caught, hope kindling bright and unmistakable in his eyes as he waited for her to continue. "I love you too," Clara said finally, the words releasing something within her chest that had remained tightly wounded for an entire year. "I never truly stopped, however much I wished I could, and I find that I no longer wish to spend my life running from that truth, however much courage it requires to embrace it instead." What followed needed no further words. Julian closed the small distance between them, and their embrace held within it everything that a year of silence and pain had kept separated. Every unspoken longing finally given permission to exist openly in the space between two people who had found their way back to each other through danger and difficulty, emerging stronger and more honest than they had ever been before. Their engagement, announced publicly a month later, drew considerably more attention than either of them might have wished, given the scandal that had once surrounded their broken betrothal a year before. But this time, as Clara walked into the grand ballroom of the Hartley estate for the formal announcement, dressed in a gown of deep gold that caught the candlelight like captured sunshine, she found herself entirely unafraid of whatever whispers might greet her arrival. She need not have worried. The story of Gerald Finch's exposure, of the courage Clara and Julian had shown in confronting his schemes together, of Henry's rescue and the genuine reconciliation that had followed, had spread throughout society in the preceding weeks, transforming the narrative that had once painted Clara as a woman discarded into something entirely different. She was seen now, throughout every drawing room and ballroom in the city, as a woman of remarkable strength and resilience, one who had faced genuine danger and emerged not diminished but stronger, more capable, and more deeply respected than the naive young woman who had first entered society years before. As she crossed the ballroom floor toward Julian, who stood waiting near the same marble column where their eyes had first met again a month before, Clara felt none of the anxious dread that had gripped her that first night of her return. The whispers that followed her passage through the crowd carried no cruelty now, no pitying judgment or thinly veiled mockery. They carried instead something like quiet admiration, the recognition of a story that had ended not in tragedy, but in a hard-won triumph few in the room had expected to witness. Julian took her hand as she reached him, raising it to his lips with a tenderness that drew soft murmurs of approval from the watching crowd. And together they turned to face the assembled guests, no longer separated by secrets or silence, but united by a truth they had both fought hard to protect and preserve. "A year ago," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly through the now-quiet ballroom, "I made a choice that caused this remarkable woman more pain than she ever deserved to endure. I will not pretend that choice away, nor ask any of you to forget the difficulty it caused. But I stand before you tonight to say, plainly and without hesitation, that Clara Bennett is the bravest, most extraordinary person I have ever known, and I intend to spend the remainder of my life proving myself worthy of the second chance she has so generously offered me." The room erupted into warm applause, and Clara, standing beside the man she had once believed lost to her forever, felt tears of genuine joy gathering in her eyes, entirely different from the tears of heartbreak that had once accompanied every thought of this house, and this ballroom. Henry, standing near the front of the gathered crowd beside Margaret, caught her eye across the room and offered a proud, relieved smile that spoke volumes about the journey they had all survived together. Lucy, practically vibrating with excitement beside her brother, waved enthusiastically, already treating Clara as the sister she had long hoped to gain. And even Charles Whitmore, standing near the edge of the crowd, offered a genuine smile of congratulation, his own reputation now firmly restored through his role in exposing his cousin's fraudulent dealings. As the orchestra began to play once more, and Julian led her onto the dance floor for the first dance of their newly announced engagement, Clara allowed herself, for the first time in over a year, to simply feel happy without reservation or fear of what might come next. The whispers that had once haunted her through this very ballroom had truly fallen silent now, replaced by something far more meaningful than mere gossip ever could be. Respect, admiration, and the quiet, powerful understanding that some stories, however painful their beginning, could still find their way toward an ending worth celebrating. As Julian pulled her closer during the dance, his eyes holding hers with the same steady devotion that had first drawn her to him years before, Clara understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges still awaited them in the years ahead, they would face them exactly as they had faced Gerald Finch's dangerous schemes. Together, without fear, and without ever again allowing silence to stand between them. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the wedding that half the county had spoken of since the engagement announcement months before. Clara stood in a small chamber adjoining the estate's chapel, her hands trembling slightly as Margaret fastened the final buttons of her gown, a soft ivory silk that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows. "You look radiant," Margaret said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Though I confess, I never imagined I would be dressing you for this particular wedding, given how things stood between you and the Duke not so very long ago." "Neither did I," Clara admitted, studying her reflection in the tall mirror, hardly recognizing the composed, joyful woman looking back at her. "Life has a way of surprising us, it seems, even after we believe we understand exactly how our story will end." A sharp knock interrupted their conversation, and Henry's voice called through the door, tight with an urgency that immediately set Clara's nerves on edge. She had grown far too familiar, this past year, with the particular tone of true alarm in her brother's voice, and she recognized it instantly now. "Clara, forgive the interruption," Henry said as Margaret opened the door to admit him. "Peter Lang has just arrived. He says it cannot wait, even for today." Clara's stomach tightened with sudden dread as Peter entered the chamber moments later, his expression grave despite the celebratory atmosphere surrounding them. "Forgive me, Miss Bennet, for bringing troubling news on such a day, but I believed you and the Duke would want to know immediately. Gerald Finch has escaped custody during his transfer to the county prison this morning." The room fell silent. Clara felt the old fear stirring in her chest, a fear she had believed fully buried months before, resurrected now at the worst possible moment. How is that possible? He was to be transferred under full guard. "We believe he had help," Peter said grimly. "Someone within the transfer detail, bribed or threatened, we do not yet know which. He vanished somewhere along the northern road less than 2 hours ago. I came directly here, rather than waste time sending word through slower channels." Julian arrived within minutes, summoned from his own preparations across the estate, his wedding attire still only half arranged as he strode into the chamber with visible alarm. "Peter has told you, then?" "He has," Clara said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coiling tightly beneath her calm exterior. "Julian, do you believe he means to disrupt the wedding, to come here today of all days?" "I believe Gerald Finch is a man who has lost everything he built through careful patience," Julian said slowly, his mind clearly working through the danger with the same sharp focus he had shown months before during their first confrontation with Finch's schemes. "A man like that, desperate and with nothing left to lose, is entirely capable of attempting something reckless, particularly against those he holds responsible for his downfall." Peter had already sent riders to alert the local constables, and additional guards were being positioned quietly around the estate's perimeter even as they spoke. But Clara could see in Julian's tense expression that he shared her fear that quiet precautions alone might not be enough to guarantee the safety of everyone gathered for the celebration. "We could postpone," Henry suggested carefully. "Wait until he is recaptured, until we know the danger has truly passed." Clara considered this only for a moment before shaking her head firmly. "No, I will not allow that man to steal one more day from us, Henry. We have already given him a year of our lives through fear and silence. I refuse to grant him a single hour more." Julian's eyes met hers, and she saw in his expression the same fierce determination that had carried them both through the darkest night of Henry's captivity months before. "Then we proceed as planned, but with every precaution available to us. I will not risk anyone's safety carelessly, Clara, not even for the sake of a wedding we have both waited far too long to celebrate. But I agree that we cannot simply surrender to his shadow any longer." The ceremony proceeded that afternoon under considerably tighter security than any guest noticed, careful arrangements made discreetly enough that the celebration itself lost none of its warmth or joy. Clara walked down the flower-lined aisle of the small chapel with her heart pounding from a mixture of genuine happiness and lingering vigilance, scanning the gathered faces briefly before allowing herself to focus entirely on Julian, waiting for her at the altar with an expression of such open devotion that every trace of fear momentarily dissolved beneath the weight of pure joy. They exchanged their vows beneath the chapel's high stone arches, surrounded by family and friends who had witnessed the difficult journey bringing them to this moment. And for a brief, perfect stretch of time, the shadow of Gerald Finch's escape seemed to fade entirely into the background of a day too precious to allow fear any real foothold. It was well after the ceremony, during the celebration held in the estate's grand hall, that trouble finally arrived, though not in the dramatic confrontation many might have expected. A stranger, disheveled and clearly exhausted from hard travel, approached the estate gates just as evening settled over the celebration, requesting urgent audience with the Duke. He was no threat at all, as it turned out, but rather a constable from a neighboring county, arriving with news that eased the tension gripping the household immediately. Gerald Finch had been recaptured only an hour earlier, apprehended attempting to board a ship bound for the continent, his brief taste of freedom ending in a scuffle with harbor authorities that left him with nothing more than a few new charges added to his already substantial list of crimes. "He will not trouble anyone again," the constable assured Julian and Clara, who had stepped away from the celebration to receive the news privately. "The magistrate intends to see him transferred under considerably heavier guard this time, to a prison from which escape will prove far more difficult." Relief washed over Clara so completely that her knees nearly buckled beneath its weight, and Julian's arm came around her immediately, steady and strong, exactly as it had been throughout every difficulty they had faced together over the preceding months. "It is truly finished, then," she said softly, allowing herself finally to believe it completely. "It is finished," Julian confirmed, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Whatever fear that man's name once carried, it holds no more power over us now, nor ever will again." They returned to their celebration with lighter hearts, and the remainder of the evening passed in genuine, unshadowed joy, filled with dancing and laughter, and the warm company of everyone who had supported them through the difficult months leading to this celebration. Lucy danced with nearly every guest in attendance, her enthusiasm infectious and entirely unaffected by the earlier tension. Henry and Margaret, whose careful friendship had deepened considerably over the preceding months into something neither of them yet dared name aloud, shared several dances that drew knowing smiles from those who noticed the growing warmth between them. And Charles Whitmore, his family's reputation now fully restored through his own demonstrated integrity, found himself the subject of considerable interest from several eligible young women throughout the county, a development that seemed to please him considerably despite his obvious embarrassment at the attention. As the celebration finally wound toward its close, and guests began departing into the star-filled spring night. Clara found herself once more on the familiar terrace where so much of her story with Julian had unfolded, standing quietly beside her husband as they watched the last carriages disappear down the long drive. "A year ago," she said softly, echoing the words Julian had spoken at their engagement announcement, "I stood in this very garden, believing my heart had been broken beyond any hope of true repair." "And now?" Julian asked, drawing her close against the cool evening air. "Now I understand that some hearts, once broken, do not simply mend back to what they were before," Clara said, resting her head against his shoulder as the stars wheeled slowly overhead. "They become something stronger instead, something that has been tested and proven rather than simply untouched by difficulty. I would not trade this understanding, Julian, not even to erase the pain that led us here." Julian said nothing in reply, simply tightening his embrace and pressing a soft kiss against her hair, and together they remained on the terrace long after the last guests had gone, content in a silence that needed no further words to convey everything that had finally, completely, been made whole between them. In the months and years that followed, the story of Clara Bennett and Duke Julian Hartley became something of a local legend throughout the county, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations for years afterward. Not simply the story of a broken engagement and its painful aftermath, but the fuller, richer tale of two people who had faced genuine danger together, who had chosen honesty over pride and courage over fear, and who had built, from the wreckage of a single cruel letter, a partnership strong enough to weather whatever challenges life might still hold in store. And whenever the tale was told, whether in grand drawing rooms or quiet cottage kitchens, it always ended the same way, with the simple truth that had finally silenced every whisper of scandal that once followed Clara's name through every ballroom in the city. Some hearts break not to remain broken forever, but to be rebuilt into something far stronger than they had ever been before, capable of carrying love through darkness and out again into lasting, well-earned light.